Good morning. It's nice to see everyone here today. I'm Arthur Stone. I'm from the Department of Psychology and the Dornsife Center for Self-Report Science. And it's my real pleasure today to be able to introduce Professors Deaton and Case, who are going to be doing today's lecture. Professor Case is the Alexander Stewart 1886 Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University, where she's also the Director of Program in Development Studies, and is having a distinguished career in economics and health, and is well known for her groundbreaking work in health over the life course, with a special emphasis on children. And she also has a particular interest in health, well-being, and economic factors in Africa, including the impact of AIDS. Anne has received many honors for her work, including the Kenneth Arrow Prize for Health Economics. And pertaining to today's lecture, she has received the Cozzarelli Prize from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences for the paper that Angus and Anne did a year or two ago. And just this past week, I'm pleased to say that Anne was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Congratulations. We are delighted that Anne has taken time from her weekend trip out here to LA to be with us today. Now, Professor Sir Angus Deaton is the Dwight D. Eisenhower Professor of Economics and International Affairs Emeritus at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, and the Economics Department at Princeton University. And it's really nice to be able to say in this more formal setting that earlier this year, he was made USC's newest presidential professor in economics, and this is his first public appearance at USC. We are looking forward to many more discussions with Angus. As a matter of fact, next week there'll be one on randomized controlled trials. Angus has contributed seminal papers on the determinants of health and well-being in rich and poor countries, on the measurement of health inequality in the US and India, in the design and conduct of household surveys, and on the measurement of consumption, and then finally on randomized controlled trials. He has a long list of honors, too many to mention here, but he is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he is a recent recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics. He was also made Knight Bachelor in 2016. Anne and Angus will present on their current joint progress concerning declining mortality in certain demographic groups in the US. The work has generated tremendous interest, with the original PNAS paper being one of the most highly downloaded in recent years. Their Brookings paper, very recent Brookings paper, expanding on the first paper, has just been released, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that today. Their work identifies disturbing trends in mortality that say much about the current economic climate and employment climate in our country, and it calls out for additional study, discussion, and action. At the close of the after Anne and Angus speak for about an hour, we're going to remove the podium, and then we're going to have a discussion. I'll start that discussion, and then we'll open it up for the audience. There are microphones on the sides. So please join me in a warm welcome for Professors Case and Deaton.
Thank you very much, Arthur, and thanks all for coming. It's really nice to open up this work and air it out and to hear from you all. We also wanted to thank the National Institutes of Health. We have a grant from the NIA that's run through the National Bureau of Economic Research, and we wanted to acknowledge that as well. Just to put this in a little bit of context, there has been a remarkable decline in mortality in the US among people of middle age and among the elderly. And that's been accompanied by reduced morbidity as well. So better health, better mental health, better ability to make one's way through the day. And annually, the CDC puts out this compendium called Health United States, in which they document all of the different things that are happening to people's health. And they generally like to celebrate the improvements. And they always document the closing of the black-white gap in life expectancy. And all those improvements are, of course, very welcome. And they play a role in when we think about the baby boomers moving into retirement age and what's that going to mean for Medicare. And the answer so far has come back, relax, these people are entering old age much healthier than the generation that came before. And among people in middle age, whoops, there we go. This just gives you a sense of what mortality looked like for whites in middle age over the 20th century. And these are mortality rates, these are deaths per 100,000, and everything we show you today will be in those terms, deaths per 100,000. And you can see that when mortality went from about 1,400 per 100,000 in 1900 down to less than 400 per 100,000 at the turn of the new century. You can see this big blip with the 1918 flu epidemic and other epidemics also at the beginning of the 20th century. There was something of a plateau around 1960, and we think that is due to the fact that people in their 40s and 50s smoked like chimneys when they were in their 20s and 30s and were dying off. But when people stopped smoking and started taking their antihypertensives, mortality decline continued, and we began to think this is what was going to keep happening. And indeed in Europe, that is indeed what did keep happening. We've picked out some comparison countries, so other English-speaking countries, Australia, Canada, the UK, and other rich countries, France, Germany, Sweden. And over this period, mortality decline in middle age happened at about 2% a year. You can name me your favorite European country, and I can pretty much guarantee you that over this time period, mortality fell at about 2% a year. So what happened in the US was really quite different. So the thick blue line are US Hispanics, who look a lot like the Brits, right? So mortality declining and declining at a good clip. Black non-Hispanics aren't on this graph. They started at a much higher mortality rate, but it's falling at an even faster clip than is true in Europe. But white non-Hispanics in the US, their mortality stopped declining and actually started to rise. Right? So we published this in the PNAS at the end of 2015, and it got kind of an outsized amount of attention. Right? And I think for at least 3 reasons. One was because this is happening to whites who are on average wealthier than Hispanics. And it's happening to whites while blacks have higher mortality rates, but they're falling very rapidly. So this comes as something of a surprise. I think the second reason was because of, one of the reasons was because of why people's mortality rates started to rise. And that was largely, the increase was due to accidental poisonings, which is the bin into which CDC puts drug overdose, suicide, and alcohol-related liver mortality, cirrhosis, and alcoholic liver disease. And if you look at every 5-year age cohort, between 30 to 34-year-olds up to 60 to 64-year-olds, what you see over this period is a really smooth trend increase in mortality and what we've come to call deaths of despair. Because we now think of all of these things as a kind of a suicide. So it's either quick with a gun, or it's slowly with drugs and alcohol, right? But this is kind of came as a big surprise to us as well when we unpacked it and we found that this was the case. And then I think the third reason it got a lot of attention was this was the end of 2015, big election coming up. And so a lot of political reporters were interested in what is this going to mean for the election? What does this mean for Donald Trump? And the day, I'll have to say, the day after the election, we pulled down county by county and put together into 1,000 regions the percent Trump vote against mortality rates for whites in this age group. And the correlation is above 0.4. Now, at first when we saw this, we were impressed. But it turns out you can put a lot of things on the x-axis, and it's going to correlate pretty strongly with votes for Trump, right? So take this with a grain of salt. But certainly it is the case that in those parts of the country where the Trump votes were higher, on average, those were areas where whites in middle age were dying in large numbers. Okay, so what are we going to do today? We want to talk about some facts to start. Because the way we're going to approach this isn't the kind of a question that you can actually approach with a randomized control trial, right? Or you can't, where are you going to get your identification from? So what we're going to do is actually put together a set of facts and then say, what if we thought this was one of the causes? And then say, are the data consistent with that? If not, if it's not, those get ruled out. But if they are consistent with it, then come up with a new set of, go deeper and look for more facts and see whether or not you can try to drill into the question that way. So we'll look by cause, by country, by sex, by education group, by race. And then after I show you a set of facts, I'm going to try to convince you that contemporaneous income is not a good marker for mortality rates. So that if we were thinking about what do we want to do about this problem, thinking about it by just giving someone income is not going to immediately be able to turn back the clock on this. And then we're going to end, though, with a model of cumulative disadvantage, which is the way we're thinking about this question now. And we'll see what you think of this as a way to make sense of the data that I'm going to show you. And I'm going to hand off, we're doing this as a tag team, so I'm going to start and I'm going to hand it off to Angus to talk about cumulative disadvantage. But first, a little throat clearing. The graph on the left is an updated version of the one I just showed you, but this one is as updated as far as we can to 2015 using the Human Mortality Database, which is a little slow in its updating for the European countries and US whites here. Now, the one criticism that we got from the first paper we published was that, well, actually, 45 to 54-year-olds over the period between 1990 and 2015, that group is getting a little bit older. So there's aging taking place within that age group. And you're not age adjusting the figures that you're showing us on the left. So the figure on the right does age adjust. You have to use a base year and say, what if the population was as in the base year, and then apply the mortality rates that are changing through time. And you can see that it makes very little difference to the big point here, which is that other countries are making progress and the US white non-Hispanics have stopped making progress. It does smooth out the European lines a little bit, and it makes the US white non-Hispanics look a lot like Germany before we left the herd. Right? So you could do this a different way. If instead of age adjusting, you could look at single years of data, single year of birth data, or single year of age data, sorry. So age 30, age 40, 45, 50, and so on, 55. And you can see that if you just look at a single year of age, the same pattern is there in all of them. That they're noisier because they're single year of age, but you see that there's a lot of progress in the comparison countries, and the U.S. is flat, or in some cases for some years of age actually increasing. So for this second paper that we've written, we've decided to go with a 5-year age band. So that's not big enough that you have to worry a lot about the aging within the band, but going along with single years of age gets to be too much to carry around at any one time. So if you look and see what the trends look like for 5-year age groups, starting age 30 to 34, 35 to 39, and so on, the European data are an average in what is sort of light brown up here. Angus likes to remind me that Australia and Canada are not in Europe, but they are part of our comparison countries, and I labeled them as Europe. And you can see that for every 5-year age group, the trend in mortality from 2000 to 2014 has been a constant at about 2%. US blacks, which are USB, and US Hispanics, which are the USH, making great progress. And then US whites are in blue. And at best, they're flat up to age 60. And in some groups, they actually, you see mortality increasing. And I think for us, the big point isn't so much, are they actually increasing a little bit or are they decreasing a little bit? It's the fact that all these other countries are making progress and we're not. And part of the reason we're not is because of these deaths of despair, which have become a much bigger fraction of total deaths in that age group over this period of time. If you look by race in the US, the blue US white non-Hispanic, you can see the increase for ages 50 to 54 is as we have been talking about, and for Hispanics has been falling at the European rate. Blacks starting with a much higher mortality rate, this is all blacks, black non-Hispanics, and falling over this period. And on this graph, we've also put US white non-Hispanics with a high school degree or less. Now, over this period for ages 50 to 54, there was a constant fraction of the population in this group that falls into this category of having a high school degree or less. It's about 40% of the population. But it's not the case that this is rising because only having a high school degree is becoming a less common event. Over this period for this group, it's the case that about 40% of the people in each of these years has a high school degree or less. And you can see that relative to the black population as a whole, working class whites started with a 30% lower death rate and ended with a 30% higher death rate. Now, if the working class whites were comparing themselves to black non-Hispanics as a group, they would see that they've taken a big step down a rung on the ladder. Now, that's not saying that that is who they compare themselves to, but it's just sort of an interesting comparison that working class whites have become a group whose mortality rate continues to rise and rise really markedly. And interestingly, if you compare blacks and whites with only a high school degree or less, what you find is real convergence in those rates. So that you see that blacks and the black mortality rates have been falling and the white rates have been rising. There's a little tick up at the end here. That's a combination of the drug overdoses now suddenly coming out in the black mortality statistics. We don't know for sure, but we think that might be fentanyl. But aside from that, what you see is this convergence between them. And if you look, say, just at 45 to 49-year-olds, the difference in the mortality rates was 600 per 100,000 back in 1992, and has come down to about 100 per 100,000. So that's just huge, right? But it means that actually these groups together are groups that we should be worried about. Now, this also got some pushback in the blogosphere when we published this work. But what we like is a Doonesbury cartoon that came out a couple of weeks ago on this. So, nice day, oh, easy for you to say, but not for you. No, my kind is dying off. Middle-aged white mortality rates are soaring. They're called deaths of despair from drugs, alcohol, suicide. Oddly, it doesn't seem to affect the blacks and Latinos. Nothing odd about that, man. We've always lived distressed lives. We're used to it. So, black privilege. Absolutely, we're lucky that way. So in the next tranche of this work, when we're trying to figure out why is it the case that these whites whose labor market opportunities have fallen through the floor, and they're not the only people whose labor market opportunities have not been great, why is it the case that this hasn't happened to black non-Hispanics as well? A lot of people have written to us to say that this, we've always lived distressed lives, right? Might actually be something that if we could find a way to quantify and go after, it would be worth doing as well. Just a couple tiny bits more of throat clearing. In the blogosphere, the question came up, well, these results are just overblown. This isn't really an important issue. Well, it's big enough that life expectancy among white non-Hispanics fell between 2013 and 2014 for the first time in decades. And the CDC, who took a long time to catch up with us, published something that was extremely helpful for us. So they came out with a data brief in June of last year, where they actually say, well, actually, Case and Deaton got it right, that increases in cause-specific death rates from only 3 causes, unintentional injuries, those are the drug overdoses, suicide, chronic liver disease, were large enough to affect all-cause death rates for white non-Hispanics in basically all of middle age. And no other cause had a large enough influence to affect age-specific death rates. Right, so that was very helpful to think, thank you, CDC, but they have access to a lot more data than we have, but that they were able to say, yes, this is actually in earnest going on. And between 2014 and 2015, actually, mortality for the population as a whole fell because of what's happening in middle age. Things are going well for children, things are going well for the elderly, but what's happening in middle age is a large enough event that life expectancy has actually dropped in the US. So what is going on here? It's happening in every state. So suicide rates and drug overdoses, the mortality rates for prime-aged adults, 25 to 64, increased in every state in the US between 1999 and 2015. And for alcohol-related deaths, except for New Jersey and Maryland, where it was flat, those rates have gone up as well in every state. Now, classifying which drugs are responsible for the drug overdoses is like trying to shoot at a moving target. And I just pulled this off the web the other day. This is what drugs are responsible for overdoses. And between 2010 and 2015, so this is pretty recent data, heroin has made a real resurgence. As a fraction of the deaths, the oxycodone deaths, hydrocodone deaths, this is your OxyContins, those as a fraction of the deaths have come down a little bit, although the number of deaths that it's responsible for continues to rise. Right, so the opioids, the prescription drug opioids, who were responsible as an accelerant to what was going on here. This is basically heroin in a pill with an FDA label on it, right? That was something that seemed to unleash just a lot of unanticipated by the medical community, I think, if not the unanticipated deaths. Those have come down a little bit in terms of a fraction. And fentanyl is becoming something that we need to worry a lot more about as well. But it seems like we're possibly moving now from prescription drugs being the biggest driver back to illegal drugs being the biggest driver. I'm going to skip those for time. The group that's being hammered are people with less education. Right, this is men and women separately. These are deaths of despair. So you see men with a high school degree or less and women with a high school degree or less. This is 50 to 54-year-olds, but I could do this for other age groups too. This is all going to go through for them. And you can see that their death rates are rising in parallel here over this period. Some reporters want to make this a story. They'll say, white men dying. And indeed they are. But the women are dying too. For reasons I don't fully understand, the Washington Post decided this was a story about white women dying. And I sent them this graph. And I said, if you look at the graph, well, to me, my eye, what it looks like is this is really a story about education, not really a story about men versus women. But they were hell-bent to write a series of articles about women's overdoses. So that's what they got. And all 3 components of this, drugs, suicide, alcohol, all 3 going up. One thing I wanted to say here is, it's really hard in here to see the Great Recession, right? This is a smooth trend up. And actually, if I took it back in time further, you also couldn't find the go-go years of the 90s. It's just a very, very smooth trend up. And it started before OxyContin was ever introduced. And it goes back as far as we have education records on the death certificates. And a lot of what I'm going to show you, we put together people with a high school degree or less and some college. And we divide the world into those with a 4-year degree and those without. And those have been fairly stable proportions of the population over the period that we're looking at. These don't show up all that well, but this is to show you geographically. 2000, it looks like these deaths of despair are sort of the largest in the Southwest. Then by 2007, they're moving into Appalachia, into Florida, the Gulf Coast, and the West Coast is getting worse. By 2011, New England, northern Midwest, and it's just deepening everywhere. And now there's not a part of the country that hasn't been touched by this. And it's not just rural either. So some news outlets would have this be a rural phenomenon. If you look at every level of urbanization, what you see is that these deaths of despair are rising. The rural is red, and yes, it has gone up, but basically they've all gone up with the large fringe MSAs being going up less rapidly, but it's going up everywhere. So it's not an urban or a rural phenomenon. It's basically throughout. This is probably the most important graph, I think, because this is going to show you, it's a bit complicated, but it's going to show you the way we're thinking about this currently, which is that if you look by birth cohort, so each of these actually has a birth cohort number attached to it, and these are the years in which we see people, and these are people with less than a BA, although we draw these graphs for everyone combined, you get the same picture, but a little bit more muted. The cohorts, this is drugs, alcohol, and suicide on the top left, drug overdoses on the top right, suicide, and then alcohol-related liver mortality, lower right. And once you get past the birth cohort of 1945, what you see is that there's an increase in mortality at any given age. And also there's a steepening of the age mortality profile, right? So it's both that at any given age, people born later are more likely to die of this, but it's also the case that as they age, they're increasingly more likely to die of it. So there's a real birth cohort phenomenon, we think, at work underneath these pictures. Liver-related mortality is a little bit different. With age, people are more likely to die of cirrhosis and alcoholic liver disease. That was always true. But the cohorts born in 35, 40, 45 are all right on top of each other. And then the cohort born in 1950, you begin to see this movement up. It only shows up after about age 45 because the liver is a really robust organ and it can take quite a lot of abuse. But then once you get beyond that level of abuse, you begin to see people dying from it. So these people were probably drinking a lot more heavily much earlier in life than the cohorts that came before. None of this would have come to light if the US had continued to make progress on heart disease. So back in the day, back in 1990, US whites didn't have a lot to brag about in terms of their death rates from heart disease relative to these comparison countries. But these comparison countries continued to make progress on heart disease, but among US whites, first progress slowed, then it stopped, and now it's actually begun to turn the wrong way. And if it had continued to make progress, it would have masked the fact that these deaths of despair were rising. So there are these two phenomena at work when you look at all-cause mortality. One is that heart disease mortality has been flatlining, and the other one is these deaths of despair have been rising. And when you put them together, you get the shape that I showed you for all-cause mortality. Now, all-cause mortality is going to look different for men and women because they're dying of different things. Women's deaths from lung cancer, for example, lagged behind the progress made by men because women started smoking later and they stopped smoking later. So that gets to be a more complicated story than just the deaths of despair, where men and women's rates were rising in parallel. But this is also part of the story that needs more attention. And we really don't have time to talk about it now, but perhaps during questions, if you're interested, we could talk about what we think might be going on here. This is all-cause mortality in 2000 and 2014 for people 45 to 54. With the country broken up into 1,000 regions. The only 3 states in which progress was made were California, New Jersey, where we live, and New York. Every other state, mortality rates rose. And you can't really see it very well, but there's this little bright line here along the I-95 corridor between Washington and Boston, where there was progress. But for the most part, mortality rates rose everywhere. Now, let's see here. If you break this up by level of education, men and women separately, we see a lot more in common between men and women than we see differences between them. Between the low point on mortality, which was 1998, and today, if you look at the change in mortality rate for each of these 5-year birth cohorts, people with a high school degree had the largest increases in mortality. People with some college but less than a 4-year BA also saw an increase, whereas people with a BA continue to make progress. And look at and this puts us quite at odds with what's going on in Europe, where Johann Mockenbach and a whole string of researchers very carefully put together data from a number of European countries and showed what mortality change looked like for people with low education and then people with high education. It's falling for everybody, but it's falling more rapidly for people with low education. Whereas in the US, people with a high school degree in each of these 5-year age groups saw increases in mortality rates, while those with a BA saw progress. So this gives us another puzzle. What the heck is different about Europe and the US that would happen? I want to spend a little bit of time on morbidity. This is a question that I love, that a lot of researchers like me love, because it's a really easy question to ask, it's a very fast question to ask, and it's a cheap question to ask. How would you say your health is at present? Excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor? It turns out the answer to that question is predictive of mortality, even 10 years out, even with a doctor's certificate. And changes in your answer to that question can actually predict changes in something physically wrong with you that will be measured the next time we see you in something like the Health and Retirement Survey. In 1993 to 1995, pulling those years, at age 30 versus age 80, you can see how people respond to that question. This is the fraction who report excellent or very good health. And I like to say to my students, you can kind of see where you are, and you can kind of see where this is going for you, right? So this is it's not pretty. It's not pretty. But what happened over time was, this is the way people answered the questions between 1999 and 2001. People in middle age were less likely to report themselves in excellent and good health. People in older ages were more likely to report themselves in excellent and very good health. That's what it looked like from 2005 to 7. That's what it looked like between 2011 and 13. Right? And the same phenomenon is seen in a very different, this was from the behavioral risk factor surveillance system. Entirely independently, this is what it looked like in the National Health Interview Survey. Right? So there's been real deterioration. Again, sort of when you think about it, at any given age, people who hit that age from a younger birth cohort are less likely to report themselves in good health. And it's the people with a high school degree or less and people with some college who see the real deterioration. People with a 4-year degree have seen very little deterioration, although the elderly among them have actually seen advances here. You could do this again by every state. The BRIF is big enough you can actually do this state by state. And I picked out a few states to show you, but every state has seen that rotation where the middle-aged people report worse health and the older age people report better health. And look how flat these lines have gotten in these states, which is when I go out to give this paper, I sometimes want to call it this, is 50 the new 80? Of course, when Angus wants to go out and give this paper, he calls it this, death in the afternoon, right? Because he's wittier than I am, which really pisses me off. So, all right, you get the same thing if you look at sciatic pain, which if any of you have suffered from pain is really a very distracting, horrible pain to have to live with. The cohort, less than BA, the cohort born 40 to 42, we see no increase with age for that cohort. The cohort born 50 to 52, you see this rotation again, this steepening of the age profile of reporting that. And it gets worse and worse for successive cohorts. Whereas for people with a BA, you almost get the sense this might be like a natural progression of what you might expect to see in terms of the fraction reporting a sciatic pain. I'm going to cut this part fairly short to give Angus as much time as he needs. But we really wanted, or I should say, I don't want to speak for Angus, I really wanted to be able to show that income mattered here, right? That if my income was able to support me, that my mortality rate, that the odds I would die would be lower. And you can cherry pick this so that you can show slides to make that happen. So here are for people age 50 to 54, this is median household income per person over the period between 1990 and 2015. And you can see that in the years, the go-go years, this went up, then you see it being fairly flat, and then here's the Great Recession, and mortality just basically mirrors that the other way around. And for people who have retired, their incomes, which are into Social Security, is indexed to mean wages, not median wages, so they kept going up, and mortality rate falling throughout that range. So this looks like some evidence that, yeah, maybe income might do it. But it doesn't work as well for other age groups. If you look at the 40 to 44-year-olds, for example, you don't get that nice mirrored shape. And the minute you break it up by education, none of this holds up. That if you look at median household income per member for people with a high school degree or less, some college, BA or more, these look like parallel shifts up and down with the Great Recession bringing them all down here at the end. Whereas over this period, people with a high school degree or less, throughout this period, mortality rates are rising. For those with a BA or more, mortality rates are falling. And it's also the case if you do black versus white, they're on different scales here. So the black median income per member is on this axis, and for whites it's on the left axis. But you see that the shape is very similar for the two of them, whereas black mortality is falling and mortality is rising for those with high school degree or less. So that left us with no explanation for what was going on. But led us to decide to push harder on other parts of it.
So let me start with this picture that Anne already showed you, which we spent a lot of time staring at. So as just to remind you, these are birth cohorts. The oldest ones, the earliest born, are on the right, and you're moving to the left. So the blue one at the end is the birth cohort who were born in 1960. They don't completely 1980. They don't completely overlap because, of course, the ones who were born in 1980, we only see them up to 2015 or so, and the earlier ones, we don't see them now because they're all dead. But the important thing to notice about this, and that we got into our heads and which took us along a little further, was to see that these pictures are moving up. So if you look at a given age, they're sort of higher for the later born cohorts. And these are all bad things. So moving up means things are getting worse. And as Anne also said, they're getting steeper. And they're getting steeper in the sense that, which means that as you get older, the effects of age are getting worse and worse and worse. So it used to be way back for the people my age, things didn't get so much worse as you get older. For the younger ones among you, things are getting worse and worse as you get, or except everybody in this room has at least a BA, so this is not about you, so don't worry about that. Okay, so the two things are it's moving up and it's rotating. So we're going to try to sort of model that and think about that. There's been a certain amount of pushback onto, if you separate out less than BA and BA, you say, well, what's happening? You can see that, first of all, this is true for less than BA, and for BA or more, you just really don't see this. You get what might be a standard age pattern. There's been some concern here that, as Anne said, in the group that we're focusing on, the 50 to 54-year-olds, there's been very little change in educational status. That's, of course, not true for all groups in the population. And so for some of these groups, there's been more people getting educated, more people with BAs. So you worry that for less than BA, the group getting worse is because there's what sociologists sometimes call residualization, that the people who are left with less than a high school degree or less than a BA are lower quality, less healthy people and so on. There is, however, this important thing called the Will Rogers effect, which is if you take people out of the bottom group and put them into the top group, it's going to make both groups worse off, right? And you don't see any of that among the BAs. And in fact, you can do this, as Anne showed you, if you pull this, so you just look at for everyone, you still see the shape on the left, albeit not as strong. I mean, it just attenuates it a bit. So we don't think education selection is playing much of a role here. We've also been pushed, we can't quite, we're economists, so we can't entirely give up on income-related labor market things here. And of course, there's a lot of, everybody who talks about this talks about the labor market. They talk about, factories closing. They talk about globalization, automation, and all those things. And so here, a big thing that's been discussed recently is the fraction of people who are not in the labor force anymore. And these are people who should be in the labor force in the sense that they're age 45 or something. And so even though the unemployment rate came back after the Great Recession, there's been this long-term decline in what's called the EPOP ratio, the employment to population ratio. And if you look here, you see the same effect for percent not in the labor force. It looks sort of like those diseases. So the percent not in the labor force is getting higher and higher for each successive cohort, and it's going up more steeply with age. And once again, it's for people with less than a BA. If you look at marriage rates, you see sort of the same thing here, which is, of course, these are the percent of the birth cohort never married, again by age. Now, of course, as you get older, your chances of being married at least once go up. So the number of people who are never married goes down, so that's why the thing slopes down. But you can once again see each successive birth cohort of the people without a BA are doing worse in this. There are a higher chance of never having been married at all ages than was the case before. So what we're beginning to talk about here is some sort of more generalized social dysfunction in which people are not in the labor market, they're not married, they're not earning as good wages, and so on. So what we're talking about, this cumulative deprivation, we think of as a long-term process of decline for those without a BA. A steady deterioration in job opportunities begin with those leaving high school in the early 1970s. The early 1970s is the sort of peak of working class success in the US. There's a famous book about the blue-collar aristocracy in the 1970s, people with a high school degree who went to work in a steel mill, who had a steady progression in earnings, they got married, they had kids, they had a good life, and they entered the middle class based on relatively little education. Over time, social and economic structures have weakened. There's high-paying, secure jobs disappeared through processes we're all well aware of. Marriage gave way to cohabitation. This decline in people getting married, it doesn't mean that people are not living with each other. So there's been an enormous increase in cohabitation. Cohabitation in the US, unlike Europe, is a largely temporary arrangement that people stay together for 3 to 5 years or a year or two, and then they split up. They think of it as the woman saying, you know, you don't really have a good job, wages aren't there for you. I would have married you in the old days, but I'm gonna take an option on you for a while, and if someone comes along with a better job, you're out. And so you get these, it's now true that a majority of white women in the United States have at least one child out of wedlock. This does not stop them having children in these cohabiting relationships. So, you know, when Charles Murray talks about this as a process of loss of virtue, you know, Anne likes to say, it's easier to keep your virtue when you have a good job and the labor market is healthy. I think that's right. On the other hand, it's hard not to see the changing social mores here as being an important part of this story. Your father and grandfather, your grandmother and grandfather could not have moved in together without getting married. They couldn't have had children, or they could, but they would have faced a lot of penalty for doing that. And so this is now normal, and it seems not to really work very well for people. So the longer one lives in this environment, the worse outcomes become. So that's our story of this getting worse with age. So you start off in this bad environment, but as you go through life, you don't get married, you have kids, you get kicked out if you're a guy, someone else gets your kids, you get to middle age, you don't know your kids anymore, you get into your 50s, you lose yet another job, series of short-term jobs, you don't know your kids anymore. This sort of whole structure of life has sort of come apart. So we model this factor as a latent variable XB. We're not going to say what it is. And we've been very struck by the pictures that Anne showed you that there seems to be a commonality across all of these dysfunctions, all of these unhappinesses going on at the same time. So it seemed like we could say, well, you know, what sort of story can we spin of that in a formal way? So we take this XB, it's fixed. This is like a draw you get at birth. Each successive birth cohorts get this XB, and then what we're going to assume is that it goes up with age linearly for each given birth cohort. So they get a different XB, but it goes up with age. So we're going to look at a whole bunch of outcomes together on this: pain, cyanic pain, chronic joint pain, markers of serious mental distress, serious mental illness, social isolation, reports of difficulty socializing with friends. We're going to look at obesity, body weight, marriage, never married, not currently married, heavy drinking, and we're going to bring in the mortality data you've already seen, the suicide and drug overdose. So here's a model in which this works. We observe someone at time t, and they were born in date b, so t minus b is just their age. So it's probably easiest to look on the right-hand side here. So YIAB is an outcome, suicide, obesity, or whatever, for I is the outcome, B is the birth year, and A is age. So we observe the cohort born in 1960 when they're 25 years old, for example. And then we model each of these outcomes as having a fixed pattern of age. And think of these graphs you saw for the people with the BA. You know, you do get sicker as you get older. There's a standard pattern of earnings over age too. And that is, if you like, the natural pattern of age. So FIA, this is different for each outcome, but there's an age pattern which is fixed over time. And then what happens is, in addition, you get this shock XB. This shock XB gets worse and worse as you get age, so that's XB times age. And the way that affects each condition is scaled up by a theta I that's specific to the condition, but the XBs are the same. And that's the idea, that there's this common cohort unfortunateness or whatever it is that starts when you enter the labor market and which gets worse with age, but it's the same in all of them. So what you can do when you just run a regression here, you run each outcome on a complete set of age indicators, that's the FIA, and birth year indicators indicated with age. So that's just the length of time the factor has got XB. XB is just going to fall out of this. We don't have to assume anything for it, and so we estimate it. And this graph here, just the red box there, shows you that the coefficient on A interacted with this cohort effect, scaled up by this theta I, which is different for each condition, will tell you what these XBs are. But we're estimating the XBs. We're not putting any structure on this at all. They can come out to be anything at all. And there's nothing at all that we do to enforce those XBs to have the same pattern for each condition. And actually, the test of the theory that's embodied in this really is to say, well, do these XBs look the same for all these different conditions? So here's a couple of pictures. We separated these out into two graphs because the ones on the right look a little bit different from the ones on the left. But the top red one is suicide. The next one down is chronic pain. The sciatic pain is the blue broken one. The green one below that is difficulty socializing. The pinkish, the magenta one is BMI. The green one below that is mental distress. And the bottom one, blue, is difficulty relaxing. On the other side, the top green one is not married. The red one, orange one is drug mortality. The blue, the sort of green patterned one is never married. The blue one near the bottom is not in the labor force. And the at risk for heavy drinking is the purple one at the bottom. So as I say, those should not be the same line because there's a theta I factor on all of them, but they should have the same shape. And there's nothing that would have stopped those things going down. So what you're really looking at is, if you think of all these cohort graphs that are tipping like this, these are the slopes of those cohort graphs for each birth cohort. And what we're saying is these slopes seem to march in great synchronicity. Is that good? Okay, synchronicity. Okay, I didn't even know that word. With each other up to scale in these things. The one on the right looked like this pattern might be getting a little worse at the very end. You can also do this for labor market outcomes, and we're not totally convinced that we got this right yet. And we're consulting with some real labor economists as to whether this is really right. And the patterns of wages look roughly like this, but there's some differences, and we're trying to get that sorted out. But it's sort of like you can think of this as a wage story too. So here's our tentative story, and it really is tentative. And we've been a little concerned that the press and everybody else leapt on this. So it's clearly very plausible. Whether it's true or not will depend on a lot of people picking this over. In fact, we have just a tiny hint. I think there's one sentence in the paper about the decline in experience, the return to experience. So, labor economists have this thing, you get a return to education, the number of years you've got, but also you get a steady increase in experience one year to the other. And that seems to have gone down at least at some point, certainly after age 40. And this appealed so much, the New Yorker wrote a whole piece about it. So, it's almost as good as Doonesbury writing up your paper. And incidentally, that Doonesbury summary is probably the best summary we've seen of the paper so far. So here's the story, slow collapse of the white working class. That each birth cohort entering the labor market without a BA after those born in 1945. Men start with lower real wages if they're later born cohort. So it's not as good a deal as your dad was getting when he didn't have a BA. The wage profiles change with each cohort with earlier and lower peak earnings. So you get to the height, the best you're ever going to do, much earlier than used to be the case for your father's generation. And that peak is lower than it was for your father. There's decreasing or zero returns to experience after age 40 for cohorts born 1960 and later. So in the end is if you've only got a BA, you just have less rewarding careers for later cohorts. And the later you're born, the less rewarding those careers are. Those, together with the changes in social mores, have led to lower marriage rates. For those who do get married, there are much higher divorce rates. We haven't shown that. Poorer family lives. And one of the things that is really distressing about this, our sociologist friend who studied kids talk about these multiple, quotes, fathers. So, you know, your girlfriend, you have a child or two children with a girlfriend, she kicks you out for someone with a higher wage. Some other guy comes and becomes the live-in man in your household with your kids. That guy might be a good dad, or he might be a really bad dad. If he's a really bad dad, that's very bad for the kids. If he's a really good dad, then when he gets kicked out, the children have yet another set of losses to go on. It's now the case in the United States that a majority of white women without a BA have had at least one child out of wedlock. So it's becoming almost a standard sort of procedure. So, and that is going to have to be bad for the kids as we go forward in this. So there's less labor force attachment, more mental distress, more difficulty socializing, more pain, more drugs, more alcohol, more suicide. And all of these follow the same pattern over birth cohorts. We think of the opioid epidemic as a major scandal, a total failure of the FDA for ever approving OxyContin and these other drugs, and the medical profession for flooding people with these inappropriately and causing enormous amounts of addiction and death. However, we don't think of this as a primary cause. I mean, Anne talked about this being an accelerant, that these things were sort of thrown out into a population that was already in great distress. And it was like pouring gasoline on the fire. If you look forward and think about the policy of this, this is really very, very distressing, because if this is really a cumulative process, even if you stopped pouring, making it worse, they would still be at that high level. It's like you're dripping on something and building a stalagmite. And if you even turn off the tap, the stalagmite is there, still there, and is going to take a very, very long way to go away. So the next generation of retirees are likely to be in worse health and mental health than current retirees, and those that follow in worse health still. Why have European countries not suffered in the same way? Well, we don't know, for instance, whether the wage patterns there are different. A lot of people are interested in these sort of cradle-to-grave apprenticeship schemes that they have in Germany, where people have long-term attachment to firms, and that seems to still go on. Europe has much better social safety nets. They have a much higher tax burden, largely through value-added tax, and those value-added tax finance much higher levels of transfers. Neither the US nor Europe does a lot of redistribution through the income tax system. It's mostly through transfers that are funded by value-added tax, which is one of the reasons why Republicans in the US very much opposed to value-added tax, because it makes it much easier to do those sort of transfer schemes. I'm not taking a position on that, but nevertheless, for whatever reason, this is not happening in Europe. It's also true that the cohabiting relationships I talked about they do happen in Europe, but in Europe, they seem to be a pretty good substitute for marriage, in that they're much more stable and they're not rotating all the time. The other thing, of course, the big puzzle is that Black non-Hispanics have not either. And you know, what Doonesbury said might be right. They've suffered for many years, and so adversity is no stranger to them. The Black churches have been, in many ways, much more supportive than the white churches have been. Whites have moved out of legacy churches into sort of do-it-yourself religions, as someone called them, or moving from legacy religions into seeking religions. And seeking religions don't offer the same degree of emotional support of home life that legacy religions do. It's also true that marriage has always been a different institution in the African American community than the white community. Remember that enslaved Africans in the United States were not allowed to marry. There's a very different tradition of marriage in black and white communities, and so they may have a resilience there from the decline in marriage, which never really took place because it's sort of different. So these are very speculative things. So skills training. One of the big things we've learned from this that I think is very important is that this is really, for us, a huge argument for single-payer healthcare. Not because in its own terms, but simply because this is eating the labor market. We spend $3 trillion a year in the United States on healthcare. If you match that to what the next highest in the world does, it would save us about $1 trillion a year. That's about $10,000 per year for each family. That would have solved this dysfunction in the labor market, or largely would. And most people in the United States who get health insurance through their employers don't understand that this is reducing their wage. They think they're getting it for free, or their employer is paying for it. And so a single-payer system would get us a long way towards that cancer that's eating out the labor market. Anne likes this quote of Vic Fuchs. And I guess, did de Tocqueville actually say this, or did Vic Fuchs paraphrase what de Tocqueville said? But he said the United States moves from the impossible to the inevitable without ever stopping at the probable. Milton Friedman has a similar quote, which is, all policy proposals seem impossible until they seem inevitable. And, I think there's actually a better chance of single-payer healthcare now than there's been for a long time, because no one knows what else to do, and they might just stumble into it by accident. And then one final slide. This was a comment on our first paper. Actually, things have gotten even worse for Fox News since that cartoon came out. And it's almost now who's going to work at Fox News. All right. Thank you very much.
The question that I want to start with is, I think it's terrific that the two of you have come across these patterns. I mean, it's so important. But it's very disturbing to me that we have all of these governmental agencies, like the CDC, like Bureau of Labor Statistics. Why is it that they weren't out there? Is it a political issue? Is it, silo issue? What do you think's going on there?
A lot of what we show, people know, but I think they know it in the silo in which they're working. So that, for example, the fact that labor force participation rates have fallen. I mean, that is very well known, but to put it together with something else is perhaps not within somebody's research agenda. But for the death rates, we were stunned that what we had come across, the CDC hadn't seen, recognized, and published on. And I think that's a silo effect as well, that there are these data briefs, and they talk about suicide rates going up among whites, but the data brief gets written, it gets put in the drawer, and that's the suicide people. And then the cirrhosis people write something about the fact that alcoholism is a rising problem among whites. That gets put in the drawer. And I think that the CDC, which is terribly underfunded, by the way, is also then working within their silos and much more interested in the questions of health equity than broader questions about what's going on. I don't know if Angus wants to.
Just a few words about that. I had a very interesting conversation with Dana Goldman the other day, who was on a National Academy panel, the one that was talking about the effects of this on Social Security and so on. Not this, but of widening health inequalities on Social Security. And he said they'd come across a lot of what we'd found, but people just kept backing away from it because it couldn't possibly be true. So there's sort of some of that, and I'm very sympathetic of that because we thought it couldn't possibly be true either. And even deep into the process before the paper was published, we thought we were going to make complete idiots of ourselves, and that publishing this and talking about this would someone would come and punish us, sort of, and say, how could you be so stupid as to really make that mistake? And that was certainly enhanced by the fact that our paper was rejected by both top medical journals, essentially instantaneously. And they just didn't want to know about this. The other thing, which is, I think, a little more another issue, is that the CDC reports, once we discovered it, we spent a lot of time scanning CDC reports and other reports to see if we could find traces of this. And there were plenty of traces. And in particular, the CDC, as Anne said when she talked about it, was celebrating this narrowing of the black-white gap, which is, of course, the reduction in black mortality is a wonderful thing, and it's been much too long in coming. But in none of those accounts did they either notice or comment on the fact that much of this closing was driven by the increasing mortality among whites. And that, of course, is not something that you would celebrate. And I think some of it is silo. There's a health inequalities silo, and they're distracting. And, we've worried about this for years. We'd say, why are you focusing so much on inequalities? And, you can actually get some people in this literature to say, okay, it would be good to level down. Inequalities are much worse than levels. So that we would prefer a world in which all mortality rates are higher if they were actually more equal with each other. I see Jim nodding there. We've been in rooms where this has been said quite loudly. And so I think this is a little bit encoded into the public health literature in particular, that there's too much, in my view, focus on inequalities, differences in health, and not enough on the absolute levels.
I just wanted to add to that in our first paper, we actually made the point that instead of benchmarking progress for Black non-Hispanics in America against whites, you should be benchmarking it to what's going on in Europe, right? So why say that we want to make it look like whites when whites are doing so badly? It seems like that's a real disservice to everyone to do that.
Right, and whites have traditionally been a relatively unhealthy group in the United States, even before this started to happen. I mean, and it's certainly true that African Americans, for many, many reasons that we know, were worse. But, and this literature also makes a big fuss about what they call Hispanic paradox. Well, that Hispanics have better health in spite of having lower socioeconomic status. And I think that paradox is only because you're thinking about it wrong. That Hispanics may again have natural health or good health where you'd expect it to be, and whites are just worse, and blacks are even worse than that. And if you look at Asian Americans and other groups, they have much, much better health than any of these groups. So, if you were to make a list of who has the best health, whites are going to be pretty near the bottom, and they're getting even further down. If you look at the white working class in the United States in terms of real wages and so on, the early 70s was the peak. And so things were worse before that. And a lot of these dysfunctions in terms of marriage, never married, and so on, were true in the 19th century, and this sort of got steadily better in the 70s. So there's certainly a sense that the early 70s, this age of the blue-collar aristocrats, may have been a one-time only thing, which happened in the 70s. That's when unions were very strong, and now there are essentially no unions anymore.
So you don't put focus on that particular issue?
No, I think we are. I mean, we think that after 1970, the white working class came apart. And that's, but I thought maybe you were talking about the mortality rates, where there is that flattening in the, no, okay.
Sir?
Yeah, just a quick question here. In terms of the healthcare cycle and the schooling, education cycle, has any research been done to compare Cuba with Europe or with the United States of America?
Well, Cuba has terrific health.
Yep, right.
But
and literacy rate, 99%.
Yeah, but it's a dictatorship. So,
Well, I understand that.
Well, I mean, I don't see too many Americans trying to get to Cuba. There are a lot of Cubans trying to get to America.
Yeah, but still, I mean, have there been any studies comparing, the healthcare system or the
healthcare system.
mortality rates down there?
One of the things that's hard about this research is that you have to have the data, right? So
You can't access it there?
getting mortality rates for countries can be quite a challenge. I mean, we think the human mortality database is a really good service, but you're limited by what people put on the death certificates as well, right? So,
But
that's
I
always
would
going to be
make just a broader point. I mean, health is not human well-being. So there are countries with very low incomes and fiercely unpleasant political systems that have produced very good health. I mean, Cuba is an example of that. But, you know, it's only if you think health is equal to human welfare, which some people do, that you'd really want to go live in Cuba.
Hi, my name is Patrick Less. I'm with the USC School of Pharmacy and Leonard Schaefer Center. Just wanted to ask, we had this massive health insurance expansion, particularly Medicaid expansion through the Affordable Care Act, yet it seems to have unfazed the mortality rate growth. Any thoughts on what the implications are? Particularly, one could argue that the Medicaid expansion is ostensibly an experiment of a single-payer system, or what we might see through such a system in the U.S., which has not seemed to have improved health outcomes, albeit through this anecdotal couple of years that we've had this. Further, you talked a lot about the labor market effects and the distortions through the tax treatment of health insurance. Why would we not just remove the tax favorability of employer-sponsored health insurance versus going all in on a single-payer system to kind of correct some of those labor market distortions?
I didn't talk about distortions at all. You talked about distortion. I mean, most people think paying more for healthcare is a really bad thing, which is what would happen if you remove the tax thing. So, I mean, I understand the arguments, but that's not what I said.
I see.
It's also the case that it's way too early to know how the Medicaid expansion is going to affect people's health, right? So I think in some ways the early papers that have been written on that are missing the mark, because it's going to be 20 years before we have any idea what those expansions really did. Although one thing that they appeared to have done was to improve people's mental health, with the question being that perhaps it improved people's mental health because they're not as worried about catastrophic medical bills.
Well, and that would be part of the concern also, is people got immediate access to mental health services, and yet we didn't see, you would think that would start to treat some of the suicide and depression and alcoholism.
I don't think mental health services do very much for any of these things you're looking at.
In fact,
Agreed.
Something I meant to say and didn't was that these three causes of death, right? So suicide, drug addiction, and alcoholism are things that the medical community has a really hard time dealing with at all, and that we spend billions of dollars through the National Institutes of Health, but we haven't really made much progress at all in how we treat those, which is a serious concern.
I mean, many people would argue, and I'm not sure I'd go along with that, but I think the first order is not, I mean, that mortality is not that much to do with healthcare, certainly in the short run. But the links here that one could look at is that the suicide, people who work on suicide much more single-mindedly than we do, have noted the large-scale closure of mental institutions where people used to be institutionalized, and they were supposed to be replaced by community health centers, which never got funded and never got built. So a lot of people who were institutionalized are out on the street, and they tend to identify that. I mean, I'm just passing that information on for interest. The other thing, though, is the pharmaceutical industry is killing thousands of people. And, you know, giving people access to more OxyContin, you know, is not really a solution here. And, you know, there are probably a huge number, you know, hundreds of thousands of people have died through some drug that should never have been approved, in my view.
So thank you. I want to reframe a little bit to go back to the initial thing, which is why did we not see it before? And one issue, I think, is that in America, we're often too narrowly focused on our own narrative. So if we only look at America, then we don't notice things that are going on. And if we assume that whites are the best thing possible, then we always use that as our standard, and so we can't sort of reframe. But as a connection to that, then if whites also thought that they were the best thing possible, then as life gets tougher, you have an experience of difficulty that you need to interpret. And an alternative, potentially useful frame would be to say, from a sort of identity-based motivation frame, if you have an experience of difficulty that's unexpected, you might assume that that means that, things are just impossible. And hence, it's just not for me. Getting that job, keeping that job, getting that family, keeping that family, all these things that are hard, once it's a surprise that it's hard, I may shift to thinking that the odds are simply low, it's not for me. Whereas the other side, right, for African Americans, people who never had an experience of ease, difficulty meant something else. That means it's important. I have to really strive for it. So the potential, reframing of the lens, opening it a little bit broader to ask, why might it be that in Europe we can reduce the rates of mortality for people who have low education, whereas we can't in America, might have to do with this sort of narrow lens, decontextualized lens that we're using.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah, I
good
agree with
point.
most of that,
Yeah.
or maybe all of it, actually. One of the things we didn't show here is that, and this is very preliminary work, but we looked at these Gallup measures of self-reported well-being, these Cantrell ladder scores, and we compared blacks and whites with and without high school education. So there's
No college.
without college education, sort of four-way split. And the traditional thing of blacks being lower than whites is true for people with a BA. If you compare blacks and whites with a BA, they're lower up to about age 40, and then they're identical after age 40. Blacks and whites, there's no difference in this. If you look at the people with less than a BA, the blacks self-reported well-being is way higher than whites at all ages over 40. Below 40, it's about the same. I'm not sure. I mean, I've argued both for and against those measures. I mean, I think they're extremely useful, but I don't think they're everything that you would look at. But there's, I think the stories you're telling are really true. But, the sociologists will talk about, the white working class was built on this concept of masculinity where the man had a job on the shop floor, he got promoted, he belonged to a union. There was a long-term stability there. They went to the churches that their fathers and grandfathers in the old country had gone to. And that life has sort of fallen apart. And that makes great difficulty for people. And the story that African Americans never had that life also makes quite a lot of sense. But it's extraordinary, too. There's been very little decline in religion, though people keep saying that. But there's been a huge decline. It's sort of like you've substituted a 12-step group for the Catholic Church. And, it just doesn't quite do the same thing.
So I was wondering if you had looked at how much of the deaths of despair, or whether the despair was more in regions or areas where the historically underprivileged communities were actually doing better. So it wasn't that, suppose you're, say, less than high school, it's not like, oh, I don't have a job, but I'm around other people who are more than high school who are doing really awesome. Or if you're white, oh, it's not that because I have a job, but I'm around immigrants or blacks or, whatever other group that's not me who's actually doing much better. So like comparing counties where there is, blacks are doing, whites are doing equally bad in the labor market, but blacks or immigrants or some other group who whites might be comparing themselves to are doing better, and that's actually leading to more despair. So it's kind of like when I drive my car and I see a Ferrari, I suddenly don't like my car.
Yeah.
We've thought about this, but we haven't done anything, right? There's this terrific book by Arlie Hochschild on Louisiana and the Tea Party in Louisiana. And this sort of central phrase she talks about there is people cutting in line. And these people who might not be doing very well, but have been they've been, according to their conception of it, they've been playing according to the rules, trying to make the American dream. And they see people who have not worked as hard as they have, or that's how they could see it, cutting in line in front of them. I'm a little skeptical in general of these relative explanations for other work I've done, but that would be I think looking at that, to the extent that one could do that, would be a really interesting thing to look at, certainly supported by those stories.
The hard part is, excuse me, is knowing who the comparison group is, right? So if you're in New England and you're in areas that it's entirely white, right? then it's hard to say that they're making comparisons with the African American community or Hispanics. Or if you're in a place, in a part of the states that have very few immigrants, it's hard to say that they're, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people aren't watching on television. And I think we've all heard statistics about the fact that the people who are most afraid of immigrants are people who've never met immigrants, right? So it's hard to know how we would identify that. But I think comparisons are just kind of a human way of us looking at how we're doing. So it seems like that would be a natural place to look if we could figure out a way to do it.
My question is about whether you're planning to pursue further the selection of different types of people into education story, with the recognition that many of these stories may be responsible for the effect concurrently. You mentioned that you didn't see much support for this Will Rogers effect, but I was wondering, in part, perhaps the college-educated group is a larger group, so adding a few additional graduates would have a smaller effect on the trend than the reverse for less than college education. And I just was wondering if, since there's the literature on instruments for returns to education, if there might be scope for an individual level study that looks a little bit more closely at the type of people who are moving between education groups after some type of shock. And part of my motivation for this question is my own experience of my family, half of my family being from a factory town, seeing as with the rise of automation, some of my family members responded by getting a BA and some did not. And I do see this playing out in my own family in terms of their health. Thank you.
That's a really good question. I'm glad you raised it, because one thing that we didn't state during the presentation is, if you look at the birth cohorts born between 1945 and 1965, there was no change in the fraction who had a BA. So like all the rotation, all that steepening that you see there, it can't be because of the selection into education. And actually between 65 and 70, there was this a dramatic increase in BAs from 30% to 40%. But from 70, 75, 80, those have been now constant at 40%. So it's hard to think, given that we see this rotation that's been very slow and steady, that selection into education can explain what we're finding. And also in the paper, you'll see in the appendix, all of these figures we show for the country as a whole, not breaking it up by education group, just to show people who are concerned that it could be because of. But it looks like if you shine the light, it is people who possibly made decisions about how much schooling to get before they knew that there was going to be this skyrocketing return to college education. And then they're stuck, right? So there's a whole generation of people who didn't realize that the college premium was going to go from 25% to 40% within a few years. But I think that
But there's also this deep question as to what it is that education does. And, would you make America a better place if everybody had a BA? And, people with BAs are not the same people to start with as people who don't have BAs. And so, you can't necessarily make that presumption. And those of us who teach, who live in these academic halls tend to think, getting educated is a solution for everything. And, it may not be. I mean, there may be people who really do like to work with their hands or who want to work in a different sort of environment. So, we've worried about the selection, but we haven't gotten much further on that.
A last question, if you can be very brief.
Okay, sure. So thank you for being here. I'm Nairi Kodaverdian from the Economics Department, and my question was whether you've considered or looked at the role of media. In a lot of movies and TV shows, you see white people drinking and partying, so maybe there's some imitation going on that could explain the discrepancy between the groups.
that's a good question. The one way in which I think media may matter is Facebook. I think that people look at each other's Facebook pages and they think everybody is always on vacation and looking very happy and that their lives are fabulous, and that that's a lie. And that also it keeps people from making the kind of real connection. I mean, when was the last time someone called you on the phone who was under the age of 40?
It wasn't a
Right.
robot.
Yeah.
It wasn't a robot.
So I
Yeah.
think the connection is huge, and I think that our ability to connect in ways that don't really make a real connection matter. But as far as like the drinking on television, I don't really know.
And Anne's answer would be more convincing if either of us had ever been on Facebook.
We come from a different century.
Well, look, please, let's thank Angus and Anne for their wonderful presentation.